Hello, everyone. Welcome to this CND webinar. How does the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons stand up legally? I know across the world there's been huge enthusiasm and excitement about the treaty that's coming into force next Friday. It's the result of enormous efforts globally from many courageous states, of course, that have stood up to the hostility from nuclear powers, but of course also so much activity and commitment over so many years from activists and advocates for disarmament. So this is a really marvelous event for us. But of course, many people have raised the key question: what difference will it make to states that don't sign it? Are nuclear weapons illegal or not? So what is the treaty's legal standing? And of course, it's so important for us as activists to know the facts to help us in our work here in the UK. That is, how to get our government on board with the ban treaty, how to start the process of nuclear disarmament. So to discuss this really crucial topic, we're very fortunate today to welcome two experts, both from the United States and both with a wealth of knowledge and experience in this field. They're going to speak for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have Q&A. So first of all, I'm going to be welcoming Peter Kuznick. Peter is Professor of History, and he's the founder director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University. He's author of numerous books. He's an active nuclear abolitionist, and he regularly provides commentary for all the major US and international media. So Peter will be contextualizing the TPNW historically and discussing it in terms of the current global nuclear threat. Then we'll turn to John Burroughs. John is a senior analyst and the former executive director of the New York-based Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy and director of the United Nations Office of the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms. John will be talking about the international law aspects of the treaty, including how it relates to law binding all states, not only those party to the treaty. And I should add, he's very familiar with the negotiations, having served as an expert on panels put on by the chair of the negotiations, Elaine White Gomez. So we couldn't have two more expert speakers. And I should just say, in talking about their credentials, so to speak, I've just barely skated the surface of the kind of incredible range of publications, experience, and so on that they both have. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to you, Peter. Please take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. On October 24th of last year, which was actually UN Day, United Nations Day, it was the 75th anniversary of the entry into force of the UN Charter. The government of Honduras became the 50th nation to ratify the UN Nuclear Ban Treaty, TPNW, meaning that the treaty goes into effect, as you said, on January 22nd. 2 days after that, January 24th, will mark the 75th anniversary of the UN General Assembly's adoption of its very first resolution, which established the commission to ensure, quote, the elimination from national armaments of atomic weapons and all other major weapons adaptable to mass destruction, the first resolution ever adopted by the United Nations. There's a delicious irony in the fact that the final ratification vote was cast by Honduras, the original banana republic, whose government took power in a US-backed coup. The treaty emanated from a series of conferences on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons held in Norway, Mexico, and Austria in 2013 and 2014, that highlighted the horrific dangers to humanity posed by nuclear weapons. The talks were completed on July 7th, 2017, at the United Nations in New York by delegates from 122 nations, which represented nearly 2/3 of the United Nations membership. 84 have signed it. Only the Netherlands voted against it. Singapore abstained. The treaty will prohibit the possession, development, production, deployment, testing, use, threatening to use, and stationing abroad of nuclear weapons for states that are party to the treaty. It requires that states provide assistance to victims of nuclear weapons use and testing, as well as environmental remediation. So this challenges the entire logic of deterrence that has prevailed since the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb back in August of 1949. The treaty goes into effect at a time of extraordinary peril. There's good reason why the hands of the doomsday clock are set at 100 seconds before midnight, the closest to annihilation since the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist introduced the clock back in 1947. I tried to contact John Mecklin, the editor of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, yesterday to see if he would give me some idea if they were going to actually move the hands of the clock closer to midnight or further from midnight, or keep them where they are when they make their decision, announce it later this month, but I haven't heard back yet. In any case, we've been going through the most dangerous period since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. So let's briefly look at where we stand. Tensions between the United States and Russia and the United States and China are the worst they've been in decades. When filmmaker Oliver Stone and I began the 2019 updated edition to our mammoth book and documentary series, The Untold History of the United States, which came out, the updated edition came out in 2019, we began with Vladimir Putin's State of the Nation address on March 1st, 2018, when Putin announced that Russia now has 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which can circumvent US missile defense. Not only has Russia been modernizing its arsenal, so have all 9 nuclear powers led by the United States under Barack Obama. There are still 13,400 nuclear weapons in the world. More than 90% of them are owned by the United States and Russia, with a couple thousand aimed at each other on hair trigger alert. What we've seen in recent years is the unraveling of the entire nuclear arms control architecture, beginning with the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, and the last piece, the New START Treaty, expires on February 5th, 2021 of this year, February 5th, which means that if we don't extend the New START Treaty, we're back to the era of an uncontrollable nuclear arms race. Every year when I take my students to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for years at the A-Bomb Museum in Hiroshima, I find myself writing down the same data because it was so shocking that by 1985, the world had reached the equivalent of 1.47 million Hiroshima bombs. So that was the insanity. If we don't extend the New START Treaty, which Biden says he will do, we could be back in that kind of insanity. And Trump has said that he welcomes a nuclear arms race, as have Billingsley and the others around him. Relations with China are equally bad. With the US freedom of navigation operation, the Strait of Taiwan, the South China Sea, not just Russia and China, India and Pakistan, which bombed each other back in 2019. We know that the latest studies on nuclear winter show that a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, in which 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons were used, would send up 5 million tons of smoke and debris into the stratosphere, circle the world within 2 weeks, block the sun's rays from hitting the earth, and this limited nuclear exchange would lead to up to 2 billion deaths. We don't have 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons. We've got 13,000 plus nuclear weapons, most of which are between 7 and 80 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. This past year, we also experienced the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki this past August. I and several of my closest colleagues did a series of webinars and international press briefings debunking the fundamental myth that nuclear weapons ended World War II and therefore were in some sense justifiable. If people have questions about that, I'd love to get to talk about that a little bit later. But the battle over ratification of the ban treaty raged fiercely for over 3 years. On the one side, we had the majority of the world's people, including Pope Francis and many world leaders. In September of 2020, 56 former prime ministers, presidents, foreign ministers, and defense ministers from 20 NATO countries, plus Japan and South Korea, 2 former secretaries general of NATO, former UN Secretary General, all implored leaders to join the treaty, which was then 6 votes shy of ratification. The letter warned that the risks of nuclear weapons use have escalated in recent years, quote, whether by accident, miscalculation, or design. It said that all responsible leaders must act now to ensure that the horrors of 1945 are never repeated. Sooner or later, our luck will run out unless we act. The Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty provides the foundation for a more secure world, free from this ultimate menace. But all 9 nuclear powers boycotted the deliberations and refused to support the treaty. The US led the effort to block its passage and implementation, sending an outrageous letter to signatories stating, quote, although we recognize your sovereign right to ratify or accede to the treaty, we believe that you have made a strategic error and should withdraw your instrument of ratification or accession. The letter said that the 5 original nuclear powers, the US, Russia, China, Britain, and France, and America's NATO allies, quote, stand unified in our opposition to the potential repercussions of the treaty. China, however, responded via Twitter, quote, China has always been advocating complete prohibition and thorough destruction of nuclear weapons. China will continuously make relentless efforts toward a nuclear weapon-free world. The letter falsely charged that the treaty, quote, turns back the clock on verification and disarmament and is dangerous to the half-century-old nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Both the administrations of Nobel laureate Barack Obama and of MAGA fascist Donald Trump, who pressured Shinzo Abe to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize, opposed the treaty as counterproductive and simultaneously dismissed it as irrelevant. The Obama administration sent NATO what it called a non-paper, whatever that is, in October 2016, titled Defense Impacts of Potential UN General Assembly Nuclear Weapons Ban, and instructed NATO members not to support the negotiations. 5 of those countries, Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey, house American nuclear weapons on their territory. The others are under the nuclear umbrella, as are
You've
Japan.
had 10 minutes now.
I'm at 10 minutes? Okay,
Yeah.
give me 2 minutes more to,
Okay, thanks.
as Japan and South Korea also boycotted the proceedings. The American and NATO officials dismissed the accord as dangerous and naive and said it could even increase the possibility that nuclear weapons will be used. Beatrice Finn, whose organization, ICANN, won and actually deserved the Nobel Peace Prize, unlike Obama, for his efforts on behalf of the TPNW, commented, it's outrageous to ask governments to withdraw from this multilateral UN treaty, but it also shows that the US knows it will have an impact. US protestations are a little bit too loud for them to really believe this is not going to have an impact. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres applauded the treaty, said, it's clear for me that we will only be entirely safe in relation to nuclear weapons the day where nuclear weapons no longer exist. public opinion polls show that 79% of Australians, 79% of Swedes, 78% of Norwegians, 75% of Japanese, 84% of Finns, 70% of Italians, can go down, 65% of Americans support their governments joining the TPNW. The organizers compare this to the campaign to ban landmines and draw comparisons to the chemical and biological weapons conventions that show that we can shame countries into going along with this, even if they don't endorse it officially. We have been making progress. There's the Don't Bank on the Bomb divestment campaign that's got banks and pension funds pulling their money out of nuclear weapons producing companies. More than 400 cities around the world have endorsed the treaty. More than 1,600 elected officials in non-ratifying countries have pledged to work to get their countries on board. Let me just close by quoting my friend, dear friend, Hiroshima survivor Setsuko Thurlow, who accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of ICAN. She said at the treaty's adoption, nuclear weapons have always been immoral, and now with enactment of the TPNW, they are also illegal. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Peter. And sorry to rush you. We've got lots of questions coming in, and I know people will want to pick your brains further when we get to that.
You know, with academics, my students sit through 2.5-hour classes, so I can never say anything in 10 minutes.
That was brilliant, though. Thank you very much. So, John, over to you.
Well, first of all, Kate, I'm honored to be participating in this CND webinar. And the TPNW is a paradigm shift toward human-centered security, away from security of states. Legally, this is expressed as an affirmation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, which are cited in the preamble. The TPNW is grounded in the Non-Proliferation Treaty and other international law, and is a powerful statement of the humanitarian and legal principles that should guide the abolition of nuclear arms. It is true that for many decades, going back to the first General Assembly resolution, that very strong statements of opposition to nuclear weapons have been adopted by the UN General Assembly. But the TPNW, in effect, has escaped the United Nations. It's out there for the world to see. And I think that's one of the most important things about it. So I will talk about how the TPNW affects nuclear armed states. But let me first talk about TPNW states parties which do not have nuclear weapons. The TPNW builds upon their obligations under the NPT and regional nuclear weapon free zones not to acquire nuclear weapons. But it also adds some things. First of all, it sets out an obligation not to seek or induce or assist anyone to engage in prohibited activity, possession, threat, or use of nuclear weapons, most importantly. This rules out participation in a nuclear arrangement in an alliance. This obviously has implications for NATO and for US alliances in Asia Pacific with Japan, South Korea, Australia. So far, countries in such alliances are not joining the TPNW. This obligation could be important in circumstances we cannot now fully imagine. For example, let's say there was a great power confrontation or conflict in Africa. TPNW states in Africa could not call upon a major power to threaten use of nuclear weapons on their behalf. Now, the obligation supports, though it does not require, divestment from companies that make nuclear weapons. And as Peter mentioned, in an innovation in the nuclear weapons sphere reflecting the rise of humanitarian disarmament, the TPNW sets forth obligations of assistance to victims of testing and use of nuclear weapons and of environmental remediation of areas affected by testing and use. It also requires, and this I hope is significant, it requires state parties in a position to do so to assist affected states parties with victim assistance and environmental remediation. And I would think this is going to start to be a subject of discussion for parties to the TPNW, starting with the first meeting of states parties, which is going to take place late this year in Vienna. So for all states, every state in the world, whether or not they're parties to the TPNW, the treaty reinforces the illegality of threat and use of nuclear weapons. And the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross is important here. The ICRC started saying quite strongly around 2010 that nuclear weapons use is both morally unacceptable and is also irreconcilable with international humanitarian law. And so and then we had in 2018 a finding of the UN Human Rights Commission that threat or use of nuclear weapons is incompatible with respect for the right to life. So if you combine developments like the ICRC coming forward, the adoption of the TPNW, the 2018 finding of the UN Human Rights Commission, we're getting a pretty good groundswell of reaffirmation of the illegality of threat and use of nuclear weapons. The inclusion of a prohibition of threat in the TPNW is a challenge to deterrence. And generally, the TPNW is a challenge to deterrence. The message is that nuclear weapons are not an acceptable basis for security. Now, obviously, the TPNW reinforces the nuclear disarmament obligation, which is cited in the preamble to the treaty. And it provides a path to achievement of a world free of nuclear weapons. And really, I think best way to understand the treaty is that non-nuclear weapon states who have been calling for decades for nuclear disarmament in the UN and in the context of the NPT, they're seeing that the nuclear armed states are not moving in any decisive way towards a nuclear weapons free world. So they decided to create a path themselves. Though this is a challenge in the sense is either join us on this path or create another path, but get moving. And it also, the TPNW also reinforces and develops obligations regarding environmental remediation and victim assistance. Now, as Peter has explained, there's rather strong opposition of the US and at least the Western nuclear weapon states to the TPNW. It has not succeeded. One of the concerns that the Western nuclear weapon states have is how the TPNW will affect the NPT. It remains to be seen how this will play out. The 5-year NPT review conference is scheduled to take place in August of this year at the United Nations in New York. Then there's going to be a meeting of states parties to the TPNW later in the year. And subsequently, there will be meetings of states parties to the TPNW every 2 years. So it's almost like there's going to be competing forums. So this is the source, I think, of the concern about the Western nuclear weapon states. And, you know, in particular, the US doesn't want to see its alliances undermined by the TPNW. But the TPNW itself expresses commitment to the NPT in the preamble. And by and large, TPNW supporters have seemed to be committed to the NPT. And, obviously the NPT has not been a success as a vehicle for disarmament, but it is also true that it contains an obligation of non-acquisition of nuclear weapons that is monitored by the IAEA. And I think most states around the world continue to think that is very important. The NPT is important, even though the safeguards obligation will apply as well to states parties to the TPNW. Now, nuclear armed states, how does it affect them? Well, a nuclear armed state can join the TPNW. This would be unilateral disarmament, and in my opinion, would be a good thing. Dismantlement can be done prior to joining the TPNW, subject to confirmation, or after joining the TPNW with verification by an international agency to be designated. Nuclear armed states, or some of them, could also jointly join the TPNW in the same ways. At least for now, I think the more operative consequence, aside from things I've already mentioned about nuclear alliances at the NPT, is how does the TPNW affect the state of international law generally? And
you've had 10 minutes.
Okay, I'm just about done.
Yep.
And as I've said, the TPNW reinforces the illegality of threatened use of nuclear weapons, and it has other obligations as well. Victim assistance, environmental remediation, non-assistance with prohibited activities, and so on. And the Western nuclear weapon states were at pains right away to say that the TPNW will not affect universal obligations or customary obligations under international law. But their saying so doesn't make it true. So I think the contribution of the TPNW with respect to the nuclear armed states is going to be its reinforcement and development of the norms, and not only legal norms, but also moral and political norms that apply to all states, including the nuclear armed states. That is it.
Thanks very much indeed, John. Okay, well, that's two brilliant introductions. So not surprisingly, we've got lots of questions coming in. I'm just going to a couple that have, what I'm going to, I'll read out two clumps, okay? So I'll read a few, then invite you both to comment on aspects of those, and then we'll have time for another round. So that's probably, rather than doing it one at a time, that's probably the best way of doing it. So I'll just read through some that I've had in advance, and then some that have come in just now. So first of all, from Janet King, one of our great activists, she says, I support the TPNW, of course, but how do we achieve abolition when no nuclear state is prepared to support it? Are we not in danger of continuing the them and us stroke nuclear weapon states versus non-nuclear weapon states status quo? Is this treaty capable of achieving abolition? And then she says, I shall, of course, continue to campaign for the abolition of nuclear weapons. And then I've got another one. I think this is probably more for Peter, but it's up to you. There is a huge enthusiasm for the TPNW. Was there similar enthusiasm when the NPT was ratified in 1970? So as a historian, you may know something about that. Then from David Lowry, who's one of our great experts on nuclear weapons, He says, I think the ban treaty contains a poorly thought out prohibition. Its Article 1 on prohibition states each state party undertakes never under any circumstances to receive the transport of or control over nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices directly or indirectly. This Article 1 prohibition will disallow non-nuclear states with disarmament verification competence, e.g. Norway, being engaged in the process of real physical nuclear dismantlement. Could the two panelists make comment on this apparent drafting problem? So, and then I've got one from Dave Webb, our chair, and then I'll open it to both of you to comment. There is the argument that the ban treaty sets a, quote, new international norm on nuclear weapons, but the nuclear weapon states are saying they will never sign. What added pressure do you think the treaty puts on the nuclear states? Is there any legal or historical precedent for how non-signatory parties to a treaty voluntarily adhere to it or parts of it? Okay, so that's our first round of questions. Who would like to go first? Peter, I'm going to select you then, as neither of you have volunteered. Go ahead, Peter. What can you tell us, your thoughts on those?
Well, can I get a second round of questions that's a little easier to answer?
I'll think about that. Go ahead, Peter.
How are we going to achieve abolition under the TPNW? Does it actually move us closer to abolition than we were under the NPT? Which the NPT, as we all know, Article 6, which calls for the nuclear weapon states to make progress toward eliminating their nuclear arsenals, has been completely ignored by all of the nuclear weapon states. Is there more pressure under the TPNW on these states to eliminate their nuclear arsenals than there was before? And I'd be curious to hear what John has to say about that, because he was much more involved than I was in the creation of the TPNW. I'm not sure that there is. There has already been a kind of moral injunction against the use of nuclear weapons. We see this as a historian. I see this back right after the first use of nuclear weapons. I see it throughout the 1950s. During the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration in the United States did everything it could to erase the line between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons. Because the world was outraged at the threat of nuclear weapons, the accumulation in the 1950s of nuclear weapons. You have to remember when Eisenhower took office in January 53, the United States had a little bit more than 1,000 nuclear weapons. When Eisenhower left office in January of 61, the US had more than 22,000 nuclear weapons. When his budgeting cycle was finished, we had 30,000 nuclear weapons. But Eisenhower introduced his Atoms for Peace program at the UN in December of 1953 on the assumption that if he could get the world to accept the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, then they would accept the legitimacy of the military uses of nuclear power. But the world has never accepted that. So there's already been kind of an international condemnation, which the nuclear weapon states, for the most part, have largely ignored in their accumulation of nuclear weapons, but they have not used them again. Well, they have used them. As Dan Ellsberg says, we've used nuclear weapons repeatedly in the same sense that a robber holding a gun to someone's head uses that gun without pulling the trigger. And that's why what's included in here about the condemnation of the threat of nuclear weapons use is so important. Because every time that a Barack Obama or any American president says that all options are on the table, they're talking about the threat of using nuclear weapons. So I think that is important. In terms of the other ones, I'm going to definitely let John handled David Lowery's question, but the question of the NPT. Yeah, there was a lot of excitement about the NPT. There was a lot of enthusiasm, and has it had some effect? It has had some effect. Has it been entirely successful in preventing more countries from joining the nuclear arms club? No. And for obvious reason. When the US invaded Iraq, North Korea issued a statement, said that the one mistake that Saddam Hussein made was to not have nuclear weapons. If Iraq had nuclear weapons, then the United States would not have been able to invade. So that's the logic. I mean, and it's a logic that is in some ways makes some sense on some level. So why do countries attain nuclear weapons? They use it defensively when they need them. Does it put them at greater risk also, as North Korea is? Yes, in some ways it does that too. The question of instances in which these kinds of treaties or conventions put added pressure, the Landmine Treaty is one that's often cited. And the organizers of ICAN said that was one of their inspirations in deciding to go ahead with the ban treaty. The United States has never endorsed the Landmine Treaty, but there's a certain kind of moral pressure that has shamed the United States and others to not use landmines. We've had the similar kind of thing with other treaties as well, and the use of cluster bombs, the use of poison gas, the chemical weapons treaty went into effect in 1997. That was 82 years after the first use of chemical weapons in Ypres, Belgium in 1915 during World War I. That people cite that also as an example, that these things can be introduced and then take time for the legal structures to catch up. Well, the reality is we don't have 82 years to get rid of nuclear weapons. We're very, very lucky to have survived this long. Those of us who have studied the Cuban Missile Crisis know that we came within a hair's breadth of annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Deterrence theory works up to the point when it stops working, and there's nobody left alive to tell us that it was a mistake, which is why we've got to get rid of these weapons now while we still have the chance. If we look at that last banner in that great 1959 movie, On the Beach, it's a sign, there is still time, brother. And they show it first when there are people rallying, and they show it again at the end when everybody's dead and the banner is still there. Well, that's the message that we have. We still have time, and now we've got to do something about it while there is still time.
Okay, thanks very much. That's round one. John, some quick remarks on that first set of questions, and then we'll go on to the next set.
One of the questions was to the effect of how can nuclear disarmament be achieved through the TPNW. I think of the TPNW as a very clearly and powerfully articulated demand for achievement of a world free of nuclear weapons. And it also provides a path. And it's valuable for those reasons. But I think we also have to recognize that it's not necessarily going to be the path that is taken for achievement of a nuclear weapons-free world, or it may combine with other paths. And I know very, very well that the general environment is bleak with respect to nuclear disarmament. However, the weapons pose risks, unacceptable risks, and most people are aware of that. And we have seen, even during the Trump administration, there was discussion and efforts to get China involved with US in Russia in trilateral arms control. Russia in turn said, great, if China wants to do that. By the way, we should also have UK and France involved in such discussions. So one mildly encouraging thing in recent years is there started to be some discussion of multilateral nuclear arms control. Well, obviously, we're going to need a multilateral process to get to serious reduction and elimination of nuclear weapons. On the question of dismantlement and whether states could participate in dismantlement and not violate the treaty, it's not something I have looked at, so I don't have a direct answer to it. But I would say that if something is reasonable to be done, that the states parties to the TPNW would find a way to make it possible. They could, adopt a position at a meeting of states parties, for example. So I think I'll stop there, Kate.
Thanks very much indeed. Okay, so we've got another set of questions, and I think looking at the time, this will be the last round. So I'm going to read them through, and then again, please do select the elements of that you would like to respond to most. So from Anne, we have, this is something, a perennial thing that comes up for activists. So I sympathise with Anne's question here. I would be interested in the explanation of how to counter the argument that nuclear weapons ended World War II more quickly than otherwise. So yes, that comes up regularly. And then from Tom, he says, setting the NPT against the TPNW is a common ploy of the UK government. And my MP says the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons would threaten the step-by-step approach of the NPT. So can you comment on that kind of approach, the kind of posing one against the other? And then Alan says, John mentioned the affirmation by the UN Human Rights Committee that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is inconsistent with the right to life. How is this applicable to the policies of the nuclear armed and allied states? Does it have any legal weight? And Shan says, what is the role now of people like Mohammed El-Baradei and Hans Blix? Because they've been very people who new to our campaigning may not know of them, but they had big role to play in recent decades. Aoife says, will Israel be bothering about the treaty in any way other than further denial? That's referring to Israel's refusal to confirm or deny that it has nuclear weapons. And then Brian says, for a member of parliament, what part of the treaty do you think is most likely to persuade them? So a mix there of history, legality, and practical issues for campaigners when we're back out on the streets. So who would like to go first?
I can go ahead. I'm just going to pick out a couple of that challenging array of questions, Kate. So
Yep.
You can come back if you think there's something else I need to address. It's a false choice, false dichotomy between a so-called step-by-step approach and a comprehensive approach. Both could be pursued at the same time. And there are very well-defined steps already, ratifying, bringing into force the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, or negotiating a fissile materials treaty, diminishing the role of nuclear weapons in security policies, and other things like adopting no first use policies. Such steps could be taken at the same time that the nuclear armed states and others engage in multilateral negotiations on nuclear disarmament, which could lead to them joining the TPNW, or in any case would certainly be complementary to the TPNW. So we should not accept this false dichotomy. On the UN Human Rights Committee finding in 2018 that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is incompatible with respect for the right to life. The right to life is set out in one of the three leading human rights instruments. That's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. What the Human Rights Committee says is an authoritative interpretation of the ICC PR. So it is important, and I think it's also useful to invoke human rights, because human rights are about the rights of individuals and peoples. So it's a very useful kind of counter framework to discussion of arms control and disarmament and non-proliferation, which is almost always framed in terms of the interactions of states. So by citing human rights, we're also saying that ultimately it's the safety and security and rights of individuals and peoples that are at stake with something as grave as nuclear weapons. And the TPNW really fulfills or exemplifies this approach, because not only does it cite international human rights law in the preamble, it also is upholding the rights of victims of nuclear testing and use. And generally it's suffused with a humanitarian perspective. So it's very much consistent with this sort of human security, human rights-based approach to achieving a world free of nuclear weapons.
Thanks very much, John. Peter, over to you.
Well, I think what I would like to do is respond to Anne's question about how we counter arguments about how that the atomic bombs ended World War II. When Barack Obama was in Hiroshima in May of 2016, he said in his talk before the cenotaph, he said, "World War II reached its brutal end in Hiroshima and Nagasaki." That's the fundamental myth that some of us have been fighting against. Let me give you just, my students sit through 12 hours on this topic, but I'm going to try to get this down in the next 3 minutes or so. Let me just say that with the Battle of Saipan in July of 1944, the Japanese defeat was inevitable, and they knew that they could not win in any traditional sense by that point. Their Navy was decimated, their Air Force decimated, Kwantung Army tied down. In February of 1945, the former Prime Minister, Prince Konoe, wrote to the Emperor and said, "I regret to inform you, but defeat is inevitable. What we have to do is reconcile that with preventing a communist takeover when that occurs." The Joint Intelligence Committee of the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued reports saying that when the Soviet Union enters the war, all Japanese will recognize that defeat is inevitable. The Japanese strategy was to try to keep the Soviets out of the war. But at Yalta in February of 45, Stalin promised Roosevelt that the Soviets would come into the Pacific War 3 months after the end of the war in Europe, which means around August 8th or August 9th. The Americans knew that that was going to force the Japanese surrender. Truman knew that as well. Truman said, Truman met with Stalin over lunch at Potsdam on July 17th. And Stalin assured him that the Russians are coming in on schedule. Truman wrote in his journal that day, "Stalin will be in the Jap war by August 15th. Finny Japs when that occurs." He writes home to his wife, Bess, the next day, says, "The Russians are coming in. We'll end the war a year sooner now. Think of all the kids who won't be killed. The Soviets invade at midnight on August 8th. They immediately blitz through the Kwantung army, forcing the Japanese surrender. The atomic bombs on August 6th in Hiroshima, August 9th in Nagasaki were stunning to the Japanese, but the Japanese already accepted that the US could wipe out their cities. The United States had already firebombed more than 100 Japanese cities. Destruction reached 99.5% in the city of Toyama. To the Japanese leaders, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, terrible as they were two more cities they were willing to sacrifice. What changed the equation for them was the Soviet invasion. As Prime Minister Suzuki says on August 13th, when he was asked why we have to surrender so quickly, he says, the Russians are coming in. They've already got Manchuria. They'll have Karafuta, Hokkaido. They'll destroy the foundation of Japan. We must surrender when we can surrender to the Americans. One thing that many people don't know is that the US had 8 5-star admirals and generals in 1945. 7 of the 8 are on record saying the atomic bombs were either morally reprehensible, militarily unnecessary, or both, led by Admiral Leahy, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But the other fact that we have to take into account is that Truman understood and said on at least 3 separate occasions that he understood he was beginning a process that could end life on the planet. And that gets us back to the TPNW, because killing hundreds of thousands of innocent people unnecessarily is a terrible war crime. But threatening all of humanity with annihilation is far, far worse. And right now, Donald Trump for 6 more days and Vladimir Putin have veto power over the future existence of life on our planet. That began with Truman. When Truman got the account of how powerful the bomb test at Alamogordo was while he was at Potsdam, he wrote in his journal, "We've discovered the most terrible weapon in history. This may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark. Not a bigger, more powerful bomb, the fire destruction." And that was the insanity that we unleashed. And it's that same insanity that the world is recognizing, and that if there's a nuclear exchange, even a limited one, it doesn't just affect the countries that are being bombed, it affects everybody on the planet, which is why this kind of moral pressure to end the nuclear arms race and abolish nuclear weapons is something that the entire world is weighing in on. And that's the moral power and the symbolic power of the TPNW, and everything that we have, every weapon we have at our disposal in order to end the nuclear arms race is something that we must use and take advantage of.
Thanks very much indeed, Peter. I knew some of that, but I didn't know all of that. So I think it's really important that we have really compelling and in-depth answers when we get these kind of glib remarks from the pro-nuclear lobby. I think having a real strong weight of evidence on our side is really crucial. So I would like to thank you both very much indeed. I know we've all been following very closely what's been happening in the United States over, well, the last few years, but in particularly over the last few weeks. I know that we're hoping that the exit of Mr. Trump, may defuse tensions somewhat. It may be possible for the United States to come back into the treaty framework some more. Maybe it will be possible for the Iran nuclear deal, for example, to be restored or revived, and maybe it'll be possible for the New START treaty to be continued and not go the way of some of the other treaties. So I'd just like to thank you both again very much indeed, to wish you all the very best. I've had many years of experience of working with colleagues in the United States peace movement, and we're full of admiration of the work that you do under very difficult circumstances. But we look forward to seeing you again. We hope in person later on this year at the NPT Review Conference, or perhaps again in Hiroshima. So thanks very much to everyone for joining us for today's session. And again, huge thanks to John and to Peter for joining us from the United States. So thanks very much, everybody, and see you all again soon, I hope. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.